The morning sun filtered through the dusty curtains of Rose Miller's bedroom, casting long shadows across the empty space where her husband used to sleep. 2 years had passed since the funeral, but the silence in the house still felt as heavy as that first night alone. At 58, Rose had everything money could buy, yet she felt like she had nothing at all. The large Victorian house on Maple Street had once been filled with laughter and warmth. She and her husband Tom had bought it 30 years ago, dreaming of filling every room with the sounds of children. But life had other plans. Years of trying, doctor visits and disappointments had taught them to find joy in each other instead. Now even that was gone. Rose walked through the empty hallways, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked away the seconds of another lonely day. She had tried everything to fill the emptiness: book, clubs, charity work, traveling to distant countries. Nothing worked. The house felt like a museum of memories, beautiful but lifeless. On this particular Tuesday morning, Rose decided to visit the local farmers market. It was one of the few places where she could be around people without having to make conversation. She could simply blend into the crowd, listen to families talking, and pretend for a moment that she wasn't completely alone. The market was busier than usual. Families wandered between the stalls, children tugging on their parents' hands, pointing at colorful fruits and homemade treats. Rose watched them with a mixture of longing and sadness. She remembered when she and Tom used to dream about bringing their own children to places like this. As she stood near the apple stand, pretending to examine the fruit, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two women were speaking in hushed voices behind her. "The Johnson family finally did it," the first woman whispered. "They couldn't afford to keep all 3 kids after losing their jobs." "What do you mean?" the second woman asked. "You know what I mean. There are people willing to pay good money for children these days. The economy has gotten so bad that desperate families are making desperate choices." Rose felt her heart stop. She turned slightly to get a better look at the women, but they had already moved away, disappearing into the crowd. The words echoed in her mind as she walked home, her groceries forgotten in the car. That evening, Rose sat in her living room, staring at the empty chairs around her dining table. The conversation from the market played over and over in her head. She knew she should be horrified by what she had heard, but instead, a terrible idea began to form in her mind. What if she could help? What if she could save children from terrible situations while also filling the emptiness in her own life? The rational part of her mind screamed that this was wrong, but the lonely part whispered that maybe this was an answer to both problems. Rose spent the next 3 days researching on the internet, following leads that led to darker corners of the web than she had ever imagined. She discovered that the economic crisis had indeed created a terrible underground market. Families who had lost everything were making choices no parent should ever have to make. By Friday, Rose had made contact with someone who went by the name Helper. The messages were careful and coded, but the meaning was clear. There were 3 siblings, ages 7, 9, and 11, whose parents had died in an accident. Their relatives couldn't afford to care for them and were looking for someone who could provide a permanent solution. Rose stared at her computer screen for hours, her finger hovering over the send button. She thought about Tom and what he would say if he could see her now. She thought about the life they had planned together, the children they had never had, the love that had nowhere to go after he died. Finally, she typed her response. She would meet them on Sunday evening at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The price was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, but Rose had inherited Tom's successful business along with his life insurance. Money was the one thing she had plenty of. Sunday came faster than Rose expected. She spent the entire day pacing around her house, changing her mind every few minutes. One moment she was convinced she was doing the right thing, saving children from a terrible fate. The next moment she was horrified by what she was planning to do. As evening approached, Rose got dressed carefully, as if she were going to church instead of participating in something that would haunt her forever. She put on her best dress, the blue one that Tom had always loved, and drove toward the meeting place. The warehouse was exactly as described, abandoned, isolated, and filled with shadows. Rose parked her car and waited, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She had brought the money in a simple black bag, cash as requested. The weight of it seemed to represent the weight of what she was about to do. At exactly 7 o'clock, a van pulled up beside her car. Two men got out, their faces hidden in the darkness. One of them approached her window and gestured for her to follow them inside the building. The warehouse was cold and empty, lit only by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the space, Rose saw them. 3 small figures, sitting on wooden crates, their heads covered with rough burlap sacks. They sat perfectly still, as if they had been trained not to move. "These are the children," one of the men said in a voice that sounded like he had done this before. "2 boys and 1 girl, just like you requested. They're healthy and well-behaved. The sacks stay on until after the transaction is complete." Rose stared at the covered figures, her heart breaking at the sight. They were so small, so vulnerable. The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. These weren't items to be bought and sold. These were real children, with real feelings and real fears. But she had come too far to turn back now. The loneliness that had driven her to this point was still there, still demanding to be filled. She handed over the bag of money, trying not to think about what she was really doing. "Remember," the man said as he counted the bills, "no official records, no questions asked. As far as anyone knows, these children don't exist. You understand what that means?" Rose nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she did understand. All she knew was that in a few minutes she would drive away with 3 children who would become her family, whether they wanted to or not. The men finished their business quickly and efficiently. They loaded the 3 covered figures into the back seat of Rose's car, handling them like packages rather than human beings. The children didn't speak or resist. They simply moved where they were directed, their covered heads turning slightly toward each other as if seeking comfort in their shared experience. As Rose started her car and pulled away from the warehouse, she caught a glimpse of the men in her rearview mirror. They were already walking back to their van, the transaction complete and forgotten as far as they were concerned. But for Rose, everything was just beginning. The drive back toward her house felt like the longest 20 minutes of her life. The children sat in complete silence in the back seat, their covered heads occasionally bumping together as the car went around curves. Rose found herself glancing at them in the mirror, wondering what they looked like, what they were thinking, whether they were as terrified as she was. About halfway home, Rose heard something that changed everything. It started as a soft whimper, barely audible over the sound of the engine. Then it became a quiet sob, muffled by the sack but unmistakably the sound of a child crying. It was the smallest one, the 7-year-old girl. Her shoulders shook as she tried to cry quietly, probably afraid of what might happen if she made too much noise. The sound cut through Rose like a knife, suddenly making real what she had just done. She had bought 3 children. She had participated in something terrible and wrong. And now she was driving home with 3 terrified kids who had no idea what was going to happen to them next. Rose pulled over to the side of the road and sat there in the darkness, listening to the muffled sobs from the back seat. The other 2 children had started moving closer to their sister, trying to comfort her even though they couldn't use their hands or see her face. In that moment, sitting on the side of a dark road with 3 covered children in her car, Rose realized that she couldn't go through with her plan. Whatever she had thought she was doing, whatever she had told herself about helping them, the truth was much simpler and much more terrible. She had bought 3 human beings because she was lonely. And now, listening to one of them cry, she understood that what she had done was unforgivable, no matter what her intentions had been. Rose stared ahead at the road that led back to her empty house, then looked in the mirror at the 3 small figures huddled together in her back seat. She had to make a choice, and she had to make it right now. Either she could continue with her original plan and try to build some kind of artificial family based on a terrible transaction, or she could try to fix what she had broken, even if it meant facing consequences she couldn't even imagine. The little girl was still crying softly, and her brothers were still trying to comfort her. In that sound, Rose heard not just fear, but a desperate need for safety and love. things that could never be bought or sold, only freely given. She took a deep breath, put the car back in drive, and made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. Rose sat in her car on the side of the dark road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Behind her, the soft crying continued, and it was the most heartbreaking sound she had ever heard. Each sob felt like a hammer blow to her conscience, shattering the wall of justification she had built around her actions. The little girl's crying was getting worse, not better. Her brothers were making small, comforting sounds, but with the sacks over there, heads in their hands apparently tied, there was little they could do to help her. Rose could see them leaning against each other in the mirror, trying to offer what comfort they could in their terrible situation. "It's okay," Rose heard one of the boys whisper, his voice barely audible through his covering. "It's going to be okay, Lily. Lily." The little girl had a name, of course she did. She wasn't just the 7-year-old girl or the merchandise. She was Lily, and she was terrified, and Rose was the reason why. Rose felt sick to her stomach. What had she done? What had she become? 2 hours ago she had been a lonely widow who missed her husband. Now she was someone who had bought 3 children from criminals in a warehouse. The transformation felt impossible and yet undeniably real. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back at her looked older, harder, like someone capable of terrible things. Is this what grief had turned her into? Is this what loneliness could make a person do? The rational part of her mind, the part that sounded like Tom's voice, was screaming at her to do the right thing. But what was the right thing? If she turned around and tried to return the children to the men at the warehouse, what would happen? To them? Would they find another buyer, someone who might be even worse than her? If she continued with her plan to take them home, what then? They would be prisoners in her house, afraid and alone, taken from one terrible situation and put into another. How was that saving them? Rose realized she was crying now too, tears streaming down her face as she sat in her car with 3 stolen children. The sound of Lily's sobs was getting to her brothers as well. She could hear them both sniffling now, trying to be brave but failing to hold back their own fear. "Where are we going?" one of the older boys asked quietly. His voice was shaky but trying to sound strong. Rose guessed he was probably the oldest, trying to take care of his siblings even in this impossible situation. Rose opened her mouth to answer, then realized she had no idea what to say. Where were they going? What was she planning to do with them? The fantasy she had built in her mind about having a ready-made family suddenly seemed not just wrong but completely insane. She turned around in her seat to look at the 3 covered figures directly. Even in the darkness she could see how small they were, how vulnerable. The sacks over their heads made them look like something from a nightmare, and she was the one who had put them in this situation. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken to them, and she was surprised by how normal her voice sounded despite the circumstances. "I don't know where we're going." The crying stopped. For a moment. All 3 children had gone completely still, as if they were trying to figure out what kind of person they were dealing with. Rose could almost feel them listening, trying to read her voice for clues about their fate. "Are you going to hurt us?" Lily asked in a tiny voice that broke Rose's heart all over again. "No," Rose said quickly, meaning it completely. "No, I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." "Then why do we have these things on our heads?" the oldest boy asked. There was anger in his voice now, along with the fear. "Why can't we see?" Rose stared at the sacks covering their faces and realized she could answer that question with actions instead of words. She got out of the car and opened the back door, her hands shaking as she reached for the ties holding the first sack in place. "I'm going to take these off," she said gently. "Don't be scared. I just want to see your faces." She started with Lily, carefully untying the rough rope that held the sack around her small head. When it came free, Rose found herself looking at a little girl with tangled brown hair and the biggest, most frightened green eyes she had ever seen. Her face was streaked with tears, and she blinked rapidly in the dim light from the car's interior. Next was the middle boy, who turned out to have the same brown hair as his sister, but with freckles scattered across his nose. He looked to be about 9, and he immediately moved closer to Lily, putting his arm around her even though his hands were still tied behind his back. The oldest boy was last. He had darker hair and serious brown eyes that looked far too old for his 11-year-old face. When the sack came off, he didn't blink or look away. Instead, he stared directly at Rose with a mixture of fear and defiance that made her step back. "What do you want with us?" he asked, his voice steady despite everything they had been through. Rose looked at the 3 children sitting in her back seat, Lily with her tear-streaked face, the middle boy trying to comfort his sister, and the oldest boy trying to protect them all with nothing but his courage. They were beautiful and heartbreaking and completely terrified, and she had done this to them. "I don't know," she said again, because it was still the only honest answer she had. The oldest boy studied her face in the dim light. "You don't know?" "I thought I did," Rose admitted. "I thought I had it all figured out, but I was wrong. I was very, very wrong." She reached into the car and carefully untied their hands. The children immediately moved closer together, the boys positioning themselves protectively on either side of their sister. They rubbed their wrists where the ropes had chafed, but none of them tried to run. Where would they go? Rose sat down heavily on the curb next to the car, suddenly feeling exhausted. The children watched her warily, probably wondering if this was some kind of trick. "What are your names?" she asked, even though she had already heard Lily's name. "I'm Lily," the little girl said quietly, her voice still shaky from crying. "Ben," said the middle boy, not taking his eyes off Rose. "Alex," said the oldest, his voice flat and suspicious. "I'm Rose," she said, feeling ridiculous introducing herself to children she had bought like groceries. "I'm sorry about the sacks. I'm sorry about all of this." "You're sorry?" Alex's voice was getting sharper. "You bought us from those men like we were things, and you're sorry?" Rose winced. "Yes." "Why?" Ben asked. "Why did you buy us?" Rose looked at these 3 children who had every right to hate her, who had every reason to be terrified of her, and tried to find a way to explain the unexplainable. "Because I was lonely," she said finally. "Because I missed my husband, and I wanted a family, and I thought maybe I could save you from something worse while also filling the empty space in my life." "That's stupid," Alex said bluntly. "Yes," Rose agreed. "It is stupid. It's worse than stupid. It's wrong." Lily had stopped crying and was listening to the conversation with wide eyes. "What happened to your husband?" she asked. "He died 2 years ago," Rose said. "We never had children of our own, and after he was gone, the house was so quiet and empty that I thought I was going crazy." "So you decided to buy some kids?" Ben asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I told myself I was rescuing you," Rose said. "But I was really just trying to rescue myself from being alone." The children looked at each other, having some kind of silent conversation that Rose couldn't interpret. Finally, Alex spoke up. "What are you going to do with us now?" It was the question Rose had been dreading because she still didn't have an answer. Her original plan felt not just wrong but impossible now that she was looking at their faces, now that she knew their names. "I don't know," she said for the 3rd time. "I can't take you home with me. That would still be kidnapping whether I paid for you or not. But I can't take you back to those men either. I don't know what they would do to you." "They would sell us to someone else," Alex said matter-of-factly. "Someone who might not feel bad about it like you do." Rose felt another wave of nausea. "How do you know that?" "Because this isn't the first time," Ben said quietly. "Our relatives tried to sell us twice before, but the deals fell through." Rose stared at them in horror. These children had been treated like property multiple times, passed around between adults who saw them as commodities instead of human beings, and she had become part of that terrible cycle. "Where are your parents?" she asked. "Dead," Alex said. "Car accident 6 months ago. Our aunt and uncle took us in, but they have 4 kids of their own, and not enough money to feed everyone. So, they decided to get rid of us, Lily added, her voice small and matter-of-fact in a way that no 7-year-old's voice should ever be. Rose felt like she was going to be sick. These children had lost their parents, been abandoned by their relatives, and then sold to strangers. And she had participated in that trauma by buying them like objects. "I have an idea," she said slowly, the beginnings of a plan forming in her mind. "But I need you to trust me just for a little while." "Why should we trust you?" Alex asked. "You bought us." "Because," Rose said, looking directly into his serious brown eyes, "I'm going to try to fix what I broke." She stood up and brushed off her dress, her mind racing. There was a way. Rose drove through the quiet streets of downtown, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the children could hear it from the back seat. The county social services building stood ahead like a beacon of hope and terror combined. It was nearly 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening, but she knew from her volunteer work that the emergency intake office stayed open 24 hours a day. "That's the social services building," Ben observed from the back seat, his voice uncertain. "Yes," Rose said, pulling into the parking lot. "Are you turning us in?" Alex asked, his voice sharp with suspicion again. Rose parked the car and turned around to look at the 3 children. They were huddled together again. But this time it wasn't because they were tied up and covered. This time they were choosing to comfort each other, and somehow that made Rose feel even worse about what she had put them through. "I'm trying to get you somewhere safe," she said. "But I need you to listen to me very carefully. What I'm about to ask you to do might not make sense, but I need you to trust me one more time." Lily had been quiet during the drive, but now she spoke up. "What do you want us to do?" Rose took a deep breath. "I'm going to tell the people inside that I found you on the side of the road, that someone had abandoned you there and I picked you up to bring you to safety." The 3 children stared at her in silence for a long moment. Finally, Alex spoke. "You want us to lie?" "I want you to not mention the warehouse or the men who brought you there," Rose said carefully. "I want you to let me handle the talking, at least at first." "Why?" Ben asked. "What difference does it make how we got here?" Rose struggled to find a way to explain without terrifying them further. "Because if they know the truth about how you ended up with me, it might make things more complicated. There might be investigations and court cases and all kinds of things that would keep you from getting placed with a good family quickly." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The real reason Rose needed them to go along with her story was because she didn't want to go to prison for participating in child trafficking. She was ashamed of her cowardice, but she wasn't ready to sacrifice the rest of her life for one terrible decision, especially if she could still help the children by getting them to safety. "What if they ask us questions directly?" Alex asked. He was clearly the spokesman for the group, the one who had learned to be cautious and protective. "Answer honestly about everything except how you ended up in my car," Rose said. "Tell them about your parents, about your relatives, about anything they want to know. Just let me explain the part about finding you tonight." The children looked at each other, having another one of their silent conversations. Rose could see them weighing their options, trying to decide if they could trust her, or if this was just another trap. "Okay," Alex said finally, "but if you try anything weird, we'll tell them everything." "I understand," Rose said, meaning it. "That's fair." She got out of the car and walked around to open their door. The children climbed out slowly, staying close together as they approached the building. Rose noticed that Alex kept himself between his siblings and her, still protecting them even though they had agreed to her plan. The social services building was brightly lit inside, a stark contrast to the dark parking lot. The lobby was nearly empty except for a security guard reading a newspaper and a receptionist behind a thick glass window. The woman looked up as they approached, taking in the sight of Rose in her good dress and 3 children in rumpled, dirty clothes. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, pressing a button so they could hear each other through the glass. "I found these children," Rose said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They were on the side of Highway 9, just sitting there. I think they've been abandoned. The receptionist's expression immediately became more alert and concerned. She pressed another button, and Rose heard her speaking quietly into a phone. Within minutes, a social worker appeared through a security door, a woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and an exhausted expression. "I'm Janet Wilson," she said, extending her hand to Rose. "I understand you found these children?" "Yes," Rose said, shaking the woman's hand. "I was driving home from visiting a friend, and I saw them, sitting on the shoulder of the road. They looked lost and scared, so I stopped." Janet knelt down to the children's eye level. "Hi there," she said gently. "I'm Janet. Can you tell me your names?" "I'm Alex," the oldest boy said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is Ben, and this is Lily." "It's nice to meet you," Janet said. "Are you brothers and sister?" "Yes," Lily said quietly, stepping closer to Alex. "Can you tell me what happened tonight? How did you end up by the road?" Rose held her breath, hoping the children would stick to their agreement. Alex looked at her quickly, then back at Janet. "Our aunt and uncle," he said carefully. "They said they couldn't take care of us anymore. They told us to get in a car with some men, and then we ended up by the road." It was brilliant, Rose realized. Alex had told the truth without mentioning the warehouse or the money. He had made it sound like their relatives had simply abandoned them, which wasn't entirely wrong. Janet's face darkened with anger at the adults, who had failed these children. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," she said. "But you're safe now, okay? We're going to take good care of you." She stood up and turned back to Rose. "This is a terrible situation, but thank goodness you found them. Can I get your contact information? We might need you to make a statement about where and when you found them." Rose gave her name and phone number, trying not to think about the possibility of being contacted later for more details. Janet wrote everything down carefully, then turned her attention back to the children. "I know this is scary," she told them, "but we're going to find you a safe place to stay tonight, and tomorrow we'll start working on a more permanent solution." "Can we stay together?" Ben asked, speaking up for the first time since they had entered the building. "We're going to do everything we can to keep you together," Janet promised. "I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to separate you if we can help it." Rose watched as Janet led the children through the security door, turning back one more time to thank her for bringing them in. As the door closed behind them, Rose felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness wash over her. She had done the right thing finally. The children were safe and would be taken care of properly. But as she walked back to her car, she realized that she was going home to the same empty house, the same silence, the same loneliness that had driven her to make such a terrible decision in the first place. The drive home felt longer than the drive to the warehouse had. Every mile took her further away from the three children who had briefly filled her car with life and voices, back toward the tomb-like quiet of her house on Maple Street. When she finally pulled into her driveway, Rose sat in her car for several minutes staring at the dark windows of her house. Nothing had changed. The loneliness was still there, just as sharp and overwhelming as before. But now it was mixed with shame and guilt, and the haunting memory of Lily's tears. She walked through her front door and was immediately struck by how different the silence felt. Before tonight, it had been the silence of loss and grief. Now it was the silence of someone who had done something terrible and would have to live with it forever. Rose made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. She kept thinking about Alex's serious brown eyes, Ben's freckled face, and Lily's terrified green eyes when she first took off that awful sack. She wondered where they were sleeping tonight. Janet had seemed competent and caring, but Rose knew that the system was overwhelmed. Were they in some crowded group home? Were they scared? Did they understand that she had been trying to help them, even though she had started by hurting them? Next morning, Rose woke up after a few hours of restless sleep. She had dreamed about the warehouse, about the men counting money while children sat covered and silent. She had dreamed about Lily crying and Alex asking why she had bought them. She made coffee and sat by her kitchen window watching the neighborhood come alive. Parents walked their children to school bus stops. Couples left for work together. Families loaded into cars for Monday morning activities. The normal life she had never been able to have continued all around her, just like it always did. Rose found herself thinking about driving back to the social services building, just to see if she could find out how the children were doing. But she knew that would be suspicious. The kind woman who had found abandoned children wouldn't show up the next day asking detailed questions about their welfare. Instead, she tried to go about her normal routine. She made breakfast she didn't eat, started reading a book she couldn't concentrate on, and attempted to do some gardening in her backyard. But everything felt different now. Every quiet moment was filled with memories of the night before. Around noon, Rose's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and for a moment her heart stopped. Had someone figured out what really happened? Were the police calling to arrest her? "Hello?" she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ms. Miller? This is Janet Wilson from County Social Services. We spoke last night." Rose spent the next 3 days thinking about Janet's phone call. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alex's serious face asking if the nice lady who helped them was okay. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had started this whole nightmare because she was lonely and desperate for connection, and now she was avoiding the very connection that was being offered to her. On Thursday morning, she finally called Janet back. "I've been thinking about visiting the children," Rose said, her voice uncertain, "but I'm not sure it's the right thing to do." "What are your concerns?" Janet asked gently. Rose struggled to find a way to express her guilt without revealing the truth. "I just worry that seeing me might remind them of that awful night. Maybe it would be better if they could just move forward and forget about it." "Ms. Miller," Janet said, "in my experience, children heal better when they're able to make sense of their experiences. Right now, you represent something positive in their story. You're the person who stopped and helped when they needed it most. Seeing you in a safe, normal environment might actually help them process what happened." Rose felt the familiar knot of shame in her stomach. If only Janet knew the whole truth about who she really was in their story. "The foster family they're staying with is wonderful," Janet continued. "The Hendersons have been doing this for 15 years. They've specifically asked to meet you, actually. They want to thank you for bringing the children to safety." After a long pause, Rose agreed to visit on Saturday afternoon. She spent the next 2 days alternating between anxiety and anticipation. Part of her desperately wanted to see the children, again to make sure they were really okay. But another part of her was terrified that they would look at her and somehow remember the truth about that night in the warehouse. Saturday came gray and overcast, matching Rose's mood as she drove to the Hendersons' house. It was a cheerful 2-story home in a family neighborhood, with toys scattered across the front yard and children's artwork taped to the windows. It looked exactly like the kind of place where children should be safe and happy. Janet met her at the front door, along with a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Rose, this is Carol Henderson," Janet said. "Carol, this is the woman I told you about." Carol immediately stepped forward and wrapped Rose in an unexpected hug. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for saving those babies." Rose felt tears prick her eyes at the genuine gratitude in Carol's voice. If she only knew, Rose thought. If she only knew what I really am. "How are they doing?" Rose asked. "Better each day," Carol said, leading them into a comfortable living room filled with well-worn furniture and family photos. Alex is still very protective of his brother and sister, but he's starting to relax a little. Ben is curious about everything and asks a million questions, and Lily... Carol paused, her expression becoming tender. "Lily is the sweetest little thing, but she's been having nightmares." Rose felt her heart clench. "Nightmares? About being covered up and not being able to see," Carol explained. "She wakes up crying and asking if she's safe, but they're getting less frequent." The guilt hit Rose like a physical blow. Lily was having nightmares because of what Rose had put her through, because Rose had driven around with 3 children who had bags over their heads like they were prisoners. "Are they here?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're in the backyard with my husband," Carol said. "They weren't sure if they wanted to see you at first, but this morning Alex said he wanted to make sure you were okay." Janet led Rose through the house to a large sliding glass door that opened onto A fenced backyard. Through the window, Rose could see a man in his 50s playing catch with Ben, while Alex pushed Lily on a swing set. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that Rose felt her breath catch in her throat. This is what childhood should look like, she thought. Not warehouses and covered faces and transactions in the dark. Carol opened the door and called out, "Kids, your visitor is here." All three children stopped what they were doing and turned to look at the door. Rose saw recognition dawn on their faces, followed by expressions she couldn't quite read. Alex said something to Ben and Lily, then walked over to the patio with his siblings close behind. "Hi," Alex said, stopping a few feet away from Rose. His voice was cautious but not unfriendly. "Hi," Rose replied, suddenly unsure of what to say. "How are you all doing?" "We're okay," Ben said, stepping forward slightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson are really nice. They let us stay in the same room." "That's wonderful," Rose said, looking at their faces and feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. They looked better than they had that night in her car. Cleaner, less afraid, more like children should look. But she could still see wariness in their eyes, especially Alex's. "Are you okay?" Lily asked suddenly, her small voice cutting through Rose's thoughts. The question caught Rose completely off guard. "Am I okay?" "Alex said you looked sad when you brought us to the building," Lily explained. "He said maybe you were sad because you found us on the road and we were scared." Rose stared down at this little girl who had every reason to hate her, who was instead worrying about her feelings. "I'm fine, sweetie. I was just worried about you three." "We were pretty scared," Ben admitted. "But we're not scared anymore. Well, not as much." Carol and Janet had stepped back to give them space to talk, and Rose found herself sitting down on the patio steps so she could be closer to the children's eye level. Almost without thinking, she asked, "Do you want to tell me what happened to you? Before I found you, I mean." Alex glanced at the adults, then back at Rose. "Our mom and dad died in a car crash," he said matter-of-factly. "We went to live with our aunt and uncle, but they said they couldn't afford to keep us. They kept talking about money all the time," Ben added, "about how expensive we were and how they didn't know what to do with us. So they decided to get rid of us," Lily said, her voice small but not bitter. It was just a fact to her, the way adults had explained her situation. Rose felt sick hearing them talk so casually about being unwanted and discarded. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." "It's not your fault," Alex said, and Rose felt the knife of guilt twist deeper in her chest. "What's going to happen to us now?" Ben asked. "Mrs. Henderson says we might find a forever family, but what if they don't want all three of us?" The question hung in the air, and Rose could see the fear beneath Ben's curious exterior. These children had been abandoned once already, and now they were terrified it would happen again. "We have to stay together," Lily said firmly, moving closer to her brothers. "We promised Mom and Dad we'd always stay together." Rose looked at these three children who had been through more trauma in 6 months than most adults experience in a lifetime, and yet they still had hope. They still believed that somewhere out there was a family who would want all three of them. "Mrs. Henderson," Rose called over to Carol, "how hard is it to find families willing to take 3 children at once?" Carol's expression became carefully neutral. "It's challenging," she admitted. "Most families are looking for 1 child, maybe 2. Finding someone willing and able to take 3 siblings, especially ones who've been through trauma, can take time." "How much time?" Alex asked, his protective instincts clearly on high alert. "It varies," Carol said gently. "Sometimes it happens quickly. Sometimes it takes months or even longer." Rose watched the children's faces fall slightly at this news. Alex immediately put his arms around his siblings, pulling them close in a gesture that was becoming familiar to her. "We'll wait," he said determinedly. "However long it takes, we'll wait for the right family, one that wants all of us." For the next hour, Rose found herself drawn into easy conversation with the 3 children. They told her about their parents, about the games they used to play, about their old house and their old school. They asked her about her life, and Rose found herself talking about Tom and their marriage, about her empty house and her garden. She was careful not to reveal too much. But there was something healing about talking to them in this normal setting, seeing them as the children they really were, instead of the terrified figures she had bought in a warehouse. As the afternoon wore on, Rose noticed something unexpected happening. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 2 years was lifting, just a little. Not because these children could fill the void in her life, she understood now that no one else could do that, but because caring about their well-being gave her something to focus on besides her own grief. When it was time to leave, the children walked her to her car. Alex hung back slightly, and as Carol and Janet were saying goodbye, he approached Rose privately. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course. Are you going to visit us again?" Rose was surprised by the question. "Do you want me to?" Alex looked back at his siblings, then at Rose. "Yeah," he said simply. "You're nice, and you helped us when we needed help." The words hit Rose harder than any condemnation could have. This brave boy, who had every reason to be suspicious of adults, wanted her to come back. "I'd like that very much," Rose said honestly. As she drove home, Rose found herself thinking not about her empty house waiting for her, but about Alex's serious eyes asking her to visit. 3 months had passed since Rose first visited Alex, Ben, and Lily at the Hendersons' house. True to her word, she had returned every Saturday afternoon, and slowly but surely, something beautiful had begun to grow between them. Not the artificial, desperate connection she had originally sought, but something real and honest and healing for all of them. Rose had also followed through on her promise to herself to become a foster care volunteer. She spent 2 evenings a week helping other children with homework, reading bedtime stories, and simply listening to kids who needed someone to care about their day. It was hard work. Many of the children were angry or scared or both, but it filled a space in Rose's heart that she hadn't even realized was empty. But it was her Saturday visits with Alex, Ben, and Lily that had become the highlight of her week. She had watched Ben's natural curiosity blossom as he peppered her with questions about everything from how cars worked to why leaves changed color. She had seen Lily's nightmares gradually fade as she grew more secure in the knowledge that she was safe and loved. And she had watched Alex slowly let down his guard, allowing himself to be a child instead of constantly protecting his siblings. Today's visit was different, though. Carol Henderson had called earlier in the week to let Rose know that there might be news about the children's future. "A family has expressed serious interest in all 3 of them," Carol had explained over the phone. "They're coming for a visit this weekend." Rose had felt a strange mixture of emotions at this news. She was thrilled that the children might finally get their forever family, but she was also surprised by how much the thought of them leaving hurt. Over the past 3 months, she had come to love these children, not as replacements for the family she'd never had, but as themselves, for who they were and who they were becoming. When Rose arrived at the Henderson house that Saturday, she found the children waiting for her in the front yard. But instead of their usual excited greetings, they seemed subdued and worried. "What's wrong?" Rose asked, immediately sensing their mood. "The family's coming tomorrow," Alex said without preamble. "To meet us." "That's wonderful news," Rose said, though she could see from their expressions that they didn't think so. "What if they don't like us?" Lily asked, moving close to Rose and slipping her small hand into Rose's larger one. "What if they change their minds?" Ben added, his usual stream of questions reduced to this one terrible possibility. "What if they only want 2 of us?" Alex finished, voicing the fear Rose could see in all their eyes. Rose knelt down so she was at their eye level, just as she had that first day 3 months ago. "Hey," she said gently, "what did we talk about when you're worried about things you can't control?" "Take deep breaths and think about what we know for sure," Lily recited, though her voice was still shaky. "And what do we know for sure?" Rose prompted. "That they asked to meet all 3 of us," Ben said slowly. "That Mrs. Henderson thinks they're a good family," Alex added. "And that no matter what happens, we have people who care about us." Lily finished looking at Rose. Rose felt her heart swell with pride at how much these children had grown over the past few months. "That's exactly right. And you know what else we know for sure?" "What?" all 3 asked in unison. "That you 3 are amazing kids, and any family would be lucky to have you. They spent the afternoon doing their usual Saturday activities. Ben helped Rose in Carol's garden while asking her 17 questions about plant biology. Lily showed Rose the new pictures she had drawn during the week, and Alex taught Rose a card game he had learned from another foster child. It was peaceful and normal, and Rose tried to memorize every moment, knowing that this might be one of their last afternoons together. As evening approached and Rose was getting ready to leave, Alex pulled her aside again, just as he had that first day. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his voice serious. "Always." "I'm scared about tomorrow," he admitted, looking younger than his 11 years. "What if the family is nice, but they don't really want us? What if they're just trying us out?" Rose's heart broke for this boy who had learned too early that adults couldn't always be trusted, that families could disappear without warning. "Alex," she said carefully, "do you remember when we first met and you asked me what I was going to do with you?" He nodded. "And I said I didn't know, but that I was going to try to fix what I had broken?" "Yeah." Rose took a deep breath, knowing she was about to make a decision that would change everything. "What if I told you that I've been thinking about adopting you three myself?" Alex stared at her in shock. "What?" "I mean," Rose continued quickly, "if you wanted that, if you thought you could be happy living with me. I know I'm not young, and I know I'm just one person instead of a whole family, but I love you three so much, and my house is big enough and, really." Alex interrupted, his eyes wide. "Really?" Rose said. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, but I didn't want to say anything until I was sure it was what you wanted, not just what I wanted." Alex was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then he called to his siblings. "Ben, Lily, come here." The other two came running, and Alex quickly explained what Rose had just told him. Rose watched their faces carefully, trying to read their reactions. "You want to adopt us?" Ben asked, his voice full of wonder. "All three of us," Lily added. "All three of you," Rose confirmed. "If that's what you want. We'd be a real family, legally and everything." The children looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations. Finally, Lily broke away from her brothers and threw her arms around Rose's waist. "Yes," she said, her voice muffled against Rose's shirt. "Yes, we want to be your family." Ben was next, wrapping his arms around Rose from the other side, followed by Alex, who hugged all of them at once. "Are you sure?" Alex asked, even as he held on tight. "We can be a lot of work. Ben asks too many questions, and Lily has bad dreams sometimes, and I get worried about everything." Rose laughed, feeling tears of joy streaming down her face. "I'm sure. And for the record, Ben's questions keep me on my toes. Lily's dreams are getting better all the time, and your worry just shows how much you love your brother and sister." They stood there in Carol Henderson's front yard, holding each other and crying happy tears, until Carol herself came outside to see what all the commotion was about. "What's going on out here?" she asked, smiling at the sight of them. "Rose wants to adopt us," Lily announced, beaming through her tears. Carol's face lit up with surprise and delight. "Oh my goodness, Rose, are you serious?" "Completely serious," Rose said. "I should have thought of it months ago, but I was so focused on them finding a normal family that I didn't consider that maybe we were already becoming a family." That evening, after Rose had gone home and the children were in bed, Carol called Janet to share the news. Janet was thrilled but cautious. There would be home studies and background checks and court proceedings, just like with any adoption, but she also knew Rose better than most people after working with her as a volunteer for 3 months. "She's perfect for them," Janet told Carol over the phone. "I've watched her with dozens of children now, and she has exactly the kind of patience and love those three need." The process took 6 months. 6 months of paperwork and interviews and home inspections. 6 months of the children staying at the Hendersons during the week and spending weekends at Rose's house, slowly transitioning into their new life. 6 months of Rose transforming her empty Victorian house into a real home, complete with bunk, beds for the boys, a princess-themed room for Lily, and a playroom in what used to be Tom's study. During this time, Rose also did something she had never expected to do. She told the children the truth about how they had really met. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon when they were all in her living room. Ben was building something with Legos. Lily was coloring at the coffee table and Alex was reading nearby. Rose had been struggling with her secret for months, and she finally realized that she couldn't build a family on a lie. "Kids," she said, setting down her own book, "I need to tell you something important." They all looked up, immediately sensing the seriousness in her tone. "It's about the night we met," Rose continued. "I haven't been completely honest about what happened." Alex put down his book and gave her his full attention. "What do you mean?" Rose took a deep breath and told them everything. About Tom's death, and her loneliness, about the conversation she had overheard at the market, about the terrible decision she had made to buy them from those men. She told them about the warehouse and the money and the moment in the car when Lily's tears had made her realize what she had really done. When she finished, the room was completely silent. Rose waited, her heart pounding, for their reaction. Finally, Alex spoke. "So you didn't just find us on the road?" "No," Rose said quietly. "I bought you. I participated in something terrible. And even though I tried to fix it, I can't undo the fact that I did it in the first place." The children looked at each other, then back at Rose. "But you brought us to the safe place," Lily said slowly. "And you kept visiting us," Ben added. "And you helped us when we were scared, even after you brought us to Mrs. Henderson's," Alex finished. Rose nodded, not trusting herself to speak.